Look, documents stick to your wrenches and textbooks. The colonel sneered, tossing her journal aside. He didn't know that in a few hours, the only thing standing between his top pilot and a fiery grave would be her voice. The Nevada sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the vast expanse of Nellis Air Force Base. Heat shimmered in visible waves above the tarmac, distorting the lethal silhouettes of the F-22 Raptors parked in perfect, menacing rows. The air was a potent cocktail of scorched asphalt, atomized jet fuel, and the faint, clean scent of the surrounding desert. A perfume that clung to everything, a constant reminder of where they were, the razor's edge of American air power. Inside the cavernous, echoing space of Hangar 7, the air was cooler but thick with tension. Here, under the cathedral-like ceiling, the Raptors were tended to like temperamental gods of war. And beneath the belly of Ghost-1, half swallowed by the intricate shadows of its landing gear, was Dr. Aris Thorne. At 30, Aris possessed a mind that had earned her a doctorate in mechanical engineering with a focus on aerospace stress dynamics. But her appearance defied the academic stereotype. Her frame was lean and wiry, built from years of contorting herself into the tightest spaces of the world's most advanced aircraft. A cascade of fiery red hair was usually wrangled into a tight, practical braid that fell between her shoulder blades. Right now, her hands, stained with hydraulic fluid and grease, moved with a surgeon's precision, her fingers dancing across the complex actuator housing of the F-22's port side flaperon. Every turn of her torque wrench was a quiet conversation with the machine. That quiet was shattered by a burst of laughter from the other side of the hangar. A small clique of pilots, flight suits unzipped to their chests in the oppressive heat, leaned against a tool locker. Their casual arrogance was a uniform as distinct as their flight gear. "Hey, Thorne." The voice belonged to Captain Razor Jensen, a pilot whose ego flew higher than his jet. "You find the problem in your little coloring book, or are you still trying to figure out which end of the wrench to hold?" The other pilots snickered. They called her Doc, but it wasn't a term of respect. It was a jab, a way to frame her as an outsider, a lab coat in a world of leather and steel. They saw the PhD, not the years of hands-on work that had made her one of the most sought-after civilian specialists in the Air Force's technical program. Aris didn't look up. She let the insult wash over her, her focus remaining on the faint, almost imperceptible vibration she'd detected in the actuator's mount. A ghost in the machine that the standard diagnostics had missed. "Just ensuring you have a functioning aircraft to fly." "Captain," she replied, her voice calm and even, carrying easily across the hangar floor. "Wouldn't want you to have to think about the mechanics of it mid-flight." Her response, devoid of anger but sharp with technical authority, silenced them for a beat. Before Razor could formulate a retort, a new presence altered the hangar's atmosphere. The casual slouching of the pilots snapped into postures of rigid attention. Colonel Valerius strode into the hangar as if he owned the very air within it. He was a man carved from granite and regulations, his uniform pressed to a razor's edge, his silver hair clipped into a severe, unforgiving style. Valerius was a product of a long line of pilots, a man who believed that the right to command the sky was a matter of bloodline and breeding, not academic credentials. He saw the world divided into two distinct classes, those who flew and those who served the flyers. His cold, assessing gaze swept the hangar, missing nothing before landing on the F-22 and the figure working beneath it. He moved with a predatory grace, his polished Oxfords making sharp, deliberate clicks on the concrete floor. "What is the delay on this aircraft?" His voice was a low baritone that cut through the ambient noise. Aris slid out from under the fuselage on her creeper, rising to her feet in a single, fluid motion. She stood at attention, though she didn't wear a uniform. "No delay, Colonel. I'm running a tertiary diagnostic on the port flaperon actuator. I detected a subharmonic vibration that didn't register on the initial systems check." Valerius's eyes narrowed. He looked from her grease-streaked face down to the open toolbox beside her. Nestled amongst the precision instruments was a custom-bound leather journal, its pages filled with her elegant, dense script and complex, hand-drawn schematics. It was her brain on paper, a place where she worked through problems that defied conventional manuals. He reached down and plucked the journal from the toolbox, his movements laced with a casual disdain. He flipped it open with his thumb. "What is this? A diary?" The question was pitched just loud enough for the nearby pilots to hear, a clear attempt to humiliate. "My research and engineering log, Colonel," Aris said, her voice remaining steady, though a cold knot formed in her stomach. "It's where I work through non-standard mechanical issues." He scanned a page filled with differential equations and a detailed diagram of a variable cycle engine concept. He didn't understand it, and that fact seemed to fuel his contempt. He snapped the book shut. "Dr. Thorne, your contract is to maintain these aircraft according to established protocols, not to conduct personal science experiments on government time. Mechanics, even those with fancy degrees, have no business pretending they can reinvent the wheel." The barb was meant to sting, and it did. It was a dismissal of her entire life's work. "This," he said, tucking the journal under his arm like a confiscated piece of contraband, "will remain in my office. Stick to the manuals. Is that understood? Colonel, that log contains years of proprietary research and critical notes on this airframe. Is that understood, Doctor?" he repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The pilots watched, silent and unmoving. This was a power play, and she was on the losing end. A long moment passed. "Understood, Colonel," she finally clipped out, her jaw tight. He gave a curt, satisfied nod and pivoted, striding out of the hangar, leaving a wake of chilled silence. The pilots dispersed quickly, avoiding her eyes. Aris stood alone in the vast space, the spot in her toolbox where her journal used to be feeling like a freshly extracted tooth. She took a slow, deep breath, the smell of jet fuel filling her lungs, and slid back under the Raptor. Her hands went back to the wrench, but her mind was cataloging the loss. He hadn't just taken a book, he had taken a part of her. And in the cold, unforgiving world of Nellis, she knew this was only the beginning. The next morning broke with the piercing clarity of the desert. The sun rose over the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of pale orange and violet before settling into its familiar, blinding white. The daily rhythm of the base began with the metallic clang of the PA system, a sound that echoed off hangar walls and sent ground crews scurrying to their posts. For Aris, the start of the day had always been a ritual of focus, a mental preparation for the complex dance of mechanics and physics that kept the F-22s flying. She walked into Hangar 7, her toolkit slung over her shoulder, the familiar weight a small comfort. But the comfort evaporated the moment she saw the duty roster posted on the main board. She scanned the list for her name, expecting to see it next to Ghost-1 or another Raptor. Instead, she found it at the very bottom of the page, next to an assignment that made her blood run cold. Dr. A. Thorne, Hangar 14, CE 17 Globemaster 3, Landing Gear Maintenance, Non-Critical Cleaning and Inspection. Hangar 14. It was on the far side of the base, a place colloquially known as the Boneyard's waiting room. It housed the lumbering C-17 cargo planes, the workhorses of the Air Force. They were magnificent in their own right, but their systems were a world away from the high-performance, bleeding-edge technology of the F-22. Landing gear maintenance was a job given to new recruits, a task so rudimentary it was insulting. It was a message delivered in the cold, impersonal block letters of a duty roster. A voice came from behind her. "Change of scenery, Doc." She turned to see Mullins, one of the senior non-commissioned officers from her old crew. He held a coffee mug, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes wouldn't quite meet hers. "Looks like it," she said, keeping her voice level. "Any idea why?" Mullins took a slow sip of his coffee. "Orders came down from Valerius's office late yesterday. Said they needed your specialized skills over with the transport wing." He let the sarcasm hang in the air for a second before his gaze dropped to the floor. "Look, Aris, it's a raw deal. Everyone knows it. It's a message," she corrected him quietly. He just nodded, a grin set to his jaw. "Better get moving. They run a tight ship over there, even if it is just polishing hubcaps." The walk to Hangar 14 felt like a journey into exile. She passed the familiar roar and hum of the fighter line, the world she knew, and entered a realm of different sounds. The lower, throatier rumble of turbofan engines, the clatter of cargo pallets being loaded. Hangar 14 was a vast, dim cavern, smelling less of jet fuel and more of hydraulic fluid and industrial floor polish. A massive C-17 squatted in the center of the space, its sheer size dwarfing everything around it. The pace here was different, slower, lacking the adrenaline-fueled urgency of the fighter wing. A young airman, barely out of his teens, handed her a bucket of degreaser and a stack of rags, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over her shoulder. "The wheel wells, ma'am. Colonel's orders are for a full deep clean." She slid under the enormous wing, the shadow of the fuselage enveloping her. The wheel well was a cramped, greasy cavern of struts, hydraulic lines, and thick rubber, all caked with the baked-on grime of 1,000 landings on dusty airstrips across the globe. She set to work, her movements precise and methodical, even for this menial task. Spray, wipe, inspect, repeat. The chemical smell of the solvent was sharp in her nostrils, but the real sting was the isolation. In Hangar 7, her world was a constant, high-speed exchange of technical data, shouted torque specs, and a shared understanding of immense responsibility. Here, conversations withered and died when she approached. The maintenance crew, a tight-knit group of their own, treated her with a detached, wary politeness. They saw the assignment, they saw who gave it, and they knew better than to get caught in the crossfire. Days bled into a monotonous rhythm. Mornings were spent in the dark, greasy confines of the C-17's undercarriage. In the afternoons, she was assigned to inspect cargo bay fittings or replace interior lighting panels. Tasks a first-year apprentice could do blindfolded. The work wasn't just simple, it was designed to be soul-crushing. It was Valerius's way of grinding her down, of proving his point that her PhD was worthless in his world. She ate lunch alone at a small table in the corner of the mess hall, the boisterous laughter of her old crew from Hangar 7 sounding like it came from another planet. They didn't shun her, not overtly, but an invisible wall had been erected. To be seen with her was to be noticed by Valerius, and no one wanted that kind of attention. The exile was complete. She was no longer Dr. Aris Thorne, the brilliant specialist who could diagnose a fighter jet's ailment by sound. She was the woman who cleaned wheel wells, a ghost haunting the edges of the base, a cautionary tale whispered among the ranks. This is what happens when you challenge the man in charge. And every night, as she lay on her bunk in her quiet quarters, the phantom weight of her confiscated journal was a constant, aching reminder of the knowledge she was being denied the chance to use. The first week of Aris's exile in Hangar 14 was a trial of isolation. The second week, it escalated into a quiet, insidious campaign of psychological warfare. The sabotage was never overt, never anything she could definitively prove, but its message was as clear as a contrail in a blue sky. You are not welcome here. It began with her tools. One afternoon, while recalibrating a pressure gauge on a C-17's landing gear strut, she reached for her digital micrometer, a precision instrument she had calibrated herself just that morning. The slot in her toolkit was empty. A frantic search of her workspace revealed nothing. An hour later, she spotted on a workbench on the opposite side of the hangar, nestled behind a stack of oil filters, its calibration clearly tampered with. When she confronted the shift supervisor, he just shrugged. Things get moved around, document. It's a busy hangar. No one claimed responsibility. No one ever did. A few days later, it was a maintenance report. She had spent 2 hours meticulously documenting a potential hydraulic leak she'd found in a secondary line. Minor, but something that needed to be logged and monitored. She filled out the triplicate form, signed it, and handed it directly to the supply office clerk, watching him stamp it and place it in the to-be-filed basket. The next morning, the same supervisor approached her, a frown on his face. "Thorne, where's that report on the hydraulic leak? The system shows it as overdue. I filed it yesterday at 1,600 hours, she stated, her voice tight. I handed it to Airman Jessup myself. A search was conducted. The report was gone. Jessup, when questioned, vaguely remembered her being at the counter but couldn't recall that specific form. It was her word against a missing piece of paper. She had to rewrite the entire report, the incident logged as a clerical error on her part. The attacks grew more personal, more pointed. She kept a specialized, high-lumen flashlight in her locker for inspecting the dark recesses of engine nacelles. She arrived one morning to find the batteries gone and the lens smeared with a thick, opaque grease. Another day, she opened her water bottle for a sip during a break and got a mouthful of fine, gritty sand that had been poured into it. Each incident was a small cut, a petty act of harassment designed to undermine her confidence and paint her as incompetent or careless. The whispers followed her down the corridors. Did you hear? The doc lost another report. She can't even keep track of her own tools. The narrative was being written for her by unseen hands, and it was a story of failure. She knew this wasn't the work of the regular Hangar 14 crew. They were wary of her, but they were professionals. This was different. It had the scent of a coordinated effort, of whispers passed down from on high. Valerius wouldn't need to give a direct order. A few pointed remarks to his loyal senior NCOs, a casual comment about how Thorne seems to be having trouble adjusting, would be enough. The system would take care of the rest. One evening, she stayed late, long after the hangar had emptied, the massive C-17 casting a long, lonely shadow under the dim security lights. She stood there, staring at the giant machine's landing gear, the site of so much of her recent drudgery. But she wasn't seeing the simple, utilitarian struts. In her mind's eye, she saw the sleek, complex, and dangerously beautiful landing gear of an F-22 Raptor. She could feel the intricate interplay of its hydraulics and avionics, a system where a single miscalculation could mean the difference between a perfect landing and a catastrophic failure. Her hands ached for that complexity, for the weight of that responsibility. Here, the stakes were as low as the work itself. The sabotage wasn't about endangering an aircraft. It was about breaking a person. She began to adapt. She started carrying her most critical tools on a belt, never letting them out of her sight. She made digital copies of every report on her personal tablet before submitting the hard copies. She triple-checked everything, trusting no one and nothing. The constant vigilance was exhausting, a second job layered on top of her official duties. It wore on her nerves, frayed the edges of her patience. The isolation became a fortress. Since she couldn't trust her colleagues, she stopped trying to engage with them at all. Her silence, born of self-preservation, was misinterpreted as arrogance. The gulf between her and the rest of the base widened with each passing day. Her reputation, once sterling, was now tarnished. She was no longer the brilliant specialist from the Raptor program. She was the problematic doctor from Hangar 14, the one who couldn't get along, the one who was always losing things. Valerius was winning. He was erasing her, not with a direct confrontation, but with 1,000 tiny, anonymous cuts. And as she walked back to her quarters each night, the distant, piercing scream of the F-22s taking off was a haunting reminder of the world she had been cast out of, a world that was being systematically taught to forget her name. The relentless Nevada sun beat down on the asphalt, but for Aris, the heat was nothing compared to the cold cage of frustration that was slowly closing around her. The demotion and the sabotage were attacks on her professional life. But the next blow was aimed at the very core of her identity, her connection to the sky. If she couldn't work on the Raptors, she could at least fly. It was her escape, her passion, the thing that had driven her to understand the physics of flight in the first place. Her logbook, still locked away in Valerius's office, was a testament to hundreds of hours spent in the cockpit of small civilian planes, a journey she had funded with double shifts and a Spartan lifestyle. On her next designated day off, she drove her old pickup truck off the base and headed for a small, dusty civilian airstrip an hour north of Las Vegas. It was a familiar place, run by a grizzled ex-Air Force mechanic named Gus who had been her first flight instructor. She walked into the sun-bleached office, the screen door slapping shut behind her. Gus looked up from the engine cowling he was polishing, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. Well, look what the cat dragged in. Dr. Thorne, haven't seen you in a coon's age, he greeted, his voice a friendly rasp. What can I do for you? Feel the need to burn some avgas? Hey, Gus, she smiled, a genuine smile for the first time in weeks. That's the plan. I was hoping to take the Cessna 172 up for a couple of hours. Shake the dust off. Gus's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. He wiped his hands on a rag, his gaze shifting to a calendar on the wall. Ah, geez, Aris. I'd love to, but the 172 is down for its annual inspection this week. Had to pull the whole fuel system apart. She won't be airworthy for a few days. Aris frowned. The whole week? That's unusual for a fuel system check. Yeah, well, found some complications, he said, his voice a little too vague. He wouldn't meet her eye. Mechanic I got coming in is booked solid. Sorry, kiddo. The hesitation, the lack of detail, it felt wrong. Gus was a straight shooter, but she didn't press him. All right, Gus. Thanks anyway. She left the airstrip with a knot of suspicion tightening in her gut. Back in her truck, she pulled out her phone and called another airfield, this one about 50 miles east. The voice on the other end was polite but firm. I'm sorry, ma'am. All our rental aircraft are fully booked for a private corporate event for the next 2 weeks. A private event? At a tiny desert airstrip? It sounded implausible. She tried a third, a glider port 70 miles away. We're not accepting any new rental clients at this time due to insurance changes. A fourth call, a fifth. The story was always different, but the result was the same. No planes available. Fully booked. New regulations. Maintenance issues. It was a chorus of denial, too uniform to be a coincidence. By the end of the afternoon, she had called every civilian airfield within a 100-mile radius of Nellis. The pattern was undeniable. Someone had put out the word. The doors to the sky, which had always been open to her, were now methodically being slammed shut in her face. She didn't need to guess who had that kind of reach, who had the motive to ground her so completely. Valerius. His influence, it seemed, extended beyond the chain-link fences of the base. A few phone calls to his old Air Force buddies who now ran the civilian operations, a quiet word about a troubled specialist from Nellis, and her name would be blacklisted. It was a masterful, cruel stroke. He was not just keeping her from the Raptors. He was keeping her for the air itself. That night, she didn't go straight back to her quarters. She drove to the perimeter fence at the far end of the base, a lonely stretch of road that overlooked the main runways. She cut the engine and sat in the deepening twilight, the silence of the desert pressing in. Under the powerful floodlights, the F-22s were being prepped for night sorties. She watched their sleek, alien shapes move with a ghostly grace, their canopies gleaming like the eyes of nocturnal predators. She could see the ground crews moving around them, their movements a familiar ballet she was no longer a part of. She rested her forehead against the cool glass of the steering wheel, the frustration of physical ache in her chest. He was trying to sever her from her very essence. He was caging her. She thought of her grandfather, an old crop duster pilot, who used to tell her, "Your hands know the aircraft before your mind does, Ari. Trust them." He meant it as a lesson in instinct in listening to the machine. But now it felt like an indictment. Her hands, which knew so much, were forbidden to touch, to fly, to create. A tear of pure, hot anger traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She wasn't just being punished. She was being unmade. Valerius wasn't just trying to win a battle of wills. He was trying to prove that without his permission, she didn't even have the right to exist in the world she loved. And as she watched the first Raptor ignite its afterburners and tear a hole in the night sky, she made a silent vow. He could take her journal, her assignment, her access to the flight line. He could even ground her, but he couldn't take her knowledge, and she would find a way to use it. The cage had been built, but she would find a flaw in its design. Weeks turned into a month, and the rhythm of Aris's exile became a dull, grinding ache. She performed her duties in Hangar 14 with a detached, mechanical precision, her mind a fortress that no amount of petty sabotage or soul-crushing monotony could breach. But while her hands were cleaning the undercarriage of a C-17, her eyes and ears were always tuned to the fighter line. From her corner of the base, she became an unwilling, unseen observer, learning the patterns of the Raptor wing. She knew which pilots were prone to rushing their pre-flight checks, which ground crews were the most meticulous, and which airframes had quirks the official manuals never mentioned. It was on a blistering Tuesday afternoon that the Harbinger appeared. She was on her knees, elbow deep in the landing gear bay of a Globemaster, when a sharp, distinct sound cut through the ambient hum of the base. The metallic snap of a pre-flight checklist being flipped with impatient speed. Her gaze shifted instantly toward the F-22 line. A young, cocky-looking captain was moving along the flank of Ghost-1, his helmet tucked under one arm. He was rushing, his movements jerky and superficial. He tapped inspection points rather than examining them. His walk around a performance of procedure, not a genuine search for faults. Aris's eyes narrowed. Her focus locked onto the aircraft's starboard wing root, with a flapper and actuator, a component identical to the one she'd been examining on Ghost 3 weeks ago, sat partially exposed. She watched as the pilot gave the control surface a cursory push with his hand. The motion was too abrupt, the pressure too heavy. And then she saw it. It wasn't sound this time, not from this distance. It was a flicker of movement, a micro-vibration in the actuator housing, almost imperceptible against the shimmering heat haze. It was a visual stutter, a tiny, unnatural shudder that lasted less than a heartbeat. To anyone else, it was nothing, a trick of the light, a heat wave. To Aris, whose mind was a library of stress dynamics and material tolerances, it was a scream. That was the vibration she had been looking for weeks ago. The subharmonic resonance. It signaled a potential hairline fracture inside the mounting, a flaw that would remain invisible to standard checks until the immense stress of high-G maneuvers or a hard landing caused it to fail catastrophically. Her cleaning rag dropped to the tarmac. She was on her feet and moving before she had made a conscious decision, her boots finding the most direct path across the painted taxi lanes, ignoring the designated walkways. The desert heat slammed into her, but she didn't feel it. Her mind was racing, calculating the potential failure points, the cascade of events that could follow. She reached the pilot just as he was about to climb the cockpit ladder. "Captain," she said, her voice low but firm, cutting through his bubble of self-assurance. "Hold your flight. I need to take a closer look at your starboard flapper and actuator." He looked down at her, his expression a mixture of annoyance and surprise. "It's fine, document. I just checked it. Green across the board. You put it under improper stress just now," she insisted, keeping her tone professional. "I observed a resonant vibration in the housing. It's indicative of a potential microfracture. The part needs to be magnifluxed before this aircraft flies." His jaw tightened. A pair of junior crew members nearby had stopped their work to watch. "With all due respect, Doctor," he said, emphasizing the title with mocking condescension, "you're a C-17 mechanic. You're not cleared to inspect my bird, let alone ground it. I have a launch window to meet. If that actuator fails on takeoff or landing, your launch window is the last thing you'll be worried about," she shot back, her gaze unwavering. The tension between them was a palpable thing, a static charge in the air, when a third voice sliced through it like a guillotine. "Is there a problem here?" Colonel Valerius's shadow fell over them both. He had appeared as if from nowhere, his presence instantly commanding the scene. His question was not an inquiry, it was an accusation. "No problem, sir," the pilot said quickly, relieved. "Just finishing my pre-flight." Dr. Thorne was offering an opinion. Aris did not look away from the colonel. "Sir, I have reason to believe the starboard flapper and actuator on Ghost-1 is compromised. I am officially requesting clearance to ground this aircraft for an immediate Level 3 inspection." Valerius's eyes, cold as chips of ice, fixed on her. He let the silence stretch, forcing her to stand under the weight of his authority. Then he raised a hand, palm out, cutting her off before she could say more. "Dr. Thorne, you have an assignment. In Hangar 14. It involves, as I recall, landing gear. It does not involve interfering with the operational readiness of my flight crews. His voice was dangerously soft, yet it carried across the tarmac. Sir, with respect, the safety of the pilot. I said enough. He hissed, the word cracking like a whip. You are a mechanic who has been reassigned for performance issues. You will not question the judgment of a qualified pilot. You will not disrupt my flight line. Return to your post. Now, the finality in his voice was absolute. The young pilot, visibly grateful, scrambled up the ladder into the cockpit. The junior crew members melted back to their tasks, suddenly fascinated by the pavement at their feet. Valerius didn't move. He stood there, watching her, daring her to defy him. Her jaw was clenched so hard it ached. Every instinct, every ounce of her training and knowledge screamed that letting that plane fly was a catastrophic mistake. But she was trapped. She had raised a flag, and he had not just ignored it. He had torn it down and thrown it at her face. Defeated, she gave a single clipped nod. She turned and walked away, the heat of his glare burning on her back. Back in the relative cool of Hangar 14, she tried to resume her work, but her hands trembled with a mixture of fury and fear. She could picture the flawed part in cross-section, the invisible crack waiting like a patient predator. From the hangar's open door, she watched Ghost-7 taxi to the runway. The roar of its twin afterburners tore across the base, a sound that shook the very rafters above her head. The Raptor launched into the sky, a beautiful, perfect machine carrying a secret she was forbidden to expose. Her hand tightened on the metal strut of the C-17's landing gear until her knuckles were bone white. There was nothing more she could do, nothing the chain of command would allow. And as the jet disappeared into the blinding blue, a cold certainty settled in her stomach. She hadn't just witnessed a safety violation. She had witnessed the planting of a seed, and she knew, with terrifying clarity, that she would be there for the harvest. The rest of that afternoon passed in a state of suspended anxiety for Aris. Every roar of a distant jet engine made her flinch, her eyes scanning the sky for any sign of trouble. The routine hum of Hangar 14 felt dissonant. A placid soundtrack laid over her internal chaos. She worked on autopilot, her body going through the motions of cleaning and inspecting, but her mind was thousands of feet in the air, flying alongside Ghost-7, listening for the telltale shudder of a failing part. She kept track of the time. A standard training sortie for a Raptor was between 90 and 120 minutes. By the 2-hour mark, her nerves were stretched taut. She found excuses to step outside the hangar, to fetch a tool from a storage shed, to consult a manual in the tech library. Anything to give her a clear view of the sky over the main runways. Finally, she saw it. Ghost-7 appeared as a speck in the distance, descending for its landing approach. It looked normal from afar, its angle of attack steady, its profile clean. But as it grew closer, she noticed it was coming in slightly faster than usual, its final approach a little less graceful, a little more forceful. It touched down on the runway harder than it should have. Not a crash, not even a bounce, but a firm, jarring impact that sent a visible shudder through the airframe. To anyone else, it was a sloppy landing by a hotshot pilot. To Aris, it was confirmation. The compromised actuator had likely forced the pilot to maintain a higher speed to ensure control surface authority, resulting in the hard landing. He had wrestled the bird home, probably without even knowing the true nature of the fight he was in. She watched it taxi back to the fighter line, her fists clenched at her sides. The pilot had survived. This time, the next morning, she walked past the maintenance bay for the Raptor wing on her way to Hangar 14. Through the open doors, she could see Ghost-7 undergoing its post-flight inspection. She lingered for a moment, pretending to tie her boot, and overheard 2 technicians talking. Where on the starboard actuator mount is way outside normal parameters for a single flight. One said, his voice laced with confusion, "Looks like it's been under some kind of weird stress. Log it and flag it for the engineers," the other replied with a shrug. Pilot probably just pulled too many GS showing off. Write it up as routine wear and tear. Aris's heart sank. Routine wear and tear. They had seen the evidence, the physical proof of her warning, but they were misinterpreting it, writing it off as the most convenient explanation. Her prophecy had been fulfilled, but it had gone unheeded. She knew the game Valerius was playing. By silencing her, he ensured that if the part failed, it would never be traced back to a warning he had ignored. If it failed on the ground, it would be a simple maintenance issue. If it failed in the air, it would be a tragic but unavoidable mechanical fault. In either scenario, his record would remain spotless, and her credibility would be irrelevant. She considered going to the wing's safety officer of filing a formal report. But what proof did she have? Her word against the colonel's. Her observation against a signed-off flight record. Her journal, the only place she had documented her initial theories on these specific actuators, was locked in Valerius's desk. She was checkmated. The incident solidified her status as a pariah. The story of her confrontation with Valerius on the flight line had spread like wildfire. She was no longer just the problematic doctor. She was now hysterical, insubordinate. The other mechanics in Hangar 14, who had once been merely wary, now actively avoided her, as if her professional desperation were a communicable disease. Her days became a study in silent observation. She continued her menial work on the C-17s, but her true work began when she clocked out. She spent her evenings in the base's technical library, pulling up schematics and material stress reports on the F-22's control surfaces. She built files on her personal tablet, creating complex simulations of the actuator's potential failure modes under different flight conditions. She was building a case, brick by painstaking brick, for a disaster she hoped would never happen. She watched Ghost-1 from a distance. The faulty actuator mount was replaced, the event logged and forgotten by everyone else. But Aris knew that the underlying issue, the culture of dismissing inconvenient truths, the arrogance of command that valued authority over expertise, had not been fixed. The flawed part was just a symptom of a deeper sickness within the system. The weight of this knowledge was a heavy burden. It was the lonely agony of Cassandra, cursed to see the future, but powerless to prevent it. She was watching a clock tick down, a long, slow fuse burning toward an inevitable explosion. She didn't know which plane it would be, or which pilot, but she knew that the system's failure to listen would eventually be paid for in blood and fire. And in the quiet of her small room, surrounded by equations and simulations, she prepared for the day she would have to say, "I told you so," a day she prayed would never come. The day began like any other in the relentless furnace of the Nevada desert. A flawless, cobalt blue sky stretched from horizon to horizon, a perfect canvas for the deadly art practiced at Nellis. On the flight line, the air thrummed with the contained power of the F-22 Raptors being prepped for a high-stakes training exercise, a simulated deep strike mission against a heavily defended target. The lead aircraft for the mission was Ghost-1. Its pilot was Major Kalen Rook Vance. Rook was a legend at Nellis, a pilot's pilot. He wasn't a hotshot like Razor Jensen. He was something far more formidable. He was preternaturally calm, his movements economical, his understanding of aerial combat so intuitive it bordered on precognitive. His call sign, Rook, suited him. He was a powerful, straight-moving piece on the chessboard of the sky. Today, his aircraft was the very same one Aris had watched with a hawk's eye for weeks. The former Ghost-7, now redesignated as Ghost-1 for this mission. The actuator had been replaced, but for Aris, watching from the distant doorway of Hangar 14, the airframe itself felt tainted. She watched Rook perform his pre-flight walk-around. Unlike the pilot she had confronted, Rook's inspection was a masterclass in professional diligence. His movements were slow, deliberate, his eyes and hands missing nothing. He spent extra time around the control surfaces, his gloved fingers tracing the seams, feeling for any incongruity. He found nothing. The flaw was too deep, the replacement part masking the systemic issue. Rook climbed into the cockpit, sealed the canopy, and gave a crisp thumbs up to his crew chief. The engines spooled up with their signature, soul-shaking roar. With a violent kick of its afterburners, Ghost One tore down the runway and launched into the sky, followed in perfect sequence by its wingman. From her exile in Hangar 14, Aris tracked their ascent until they were just silver glints against the sun. She forced herself back to her work. The familiar, greasy smell of the C-17's wheel well a stark contrast to the clean, lethal grace of the machine she truly cared for. 20 minutes into the mission, at 40,000 feet and traveling at Mach 1.5, Rook was deep in simulated enemy territory. He banked the Raptor hard to the left, preparing to acquire a target lock. That's when it happened. As he pulled the side stick, a violent, uncommanded shudder ripped through the airframe. The new starboard flapper and actuator, subjected to the immense pressures of supersonic, high-G maneuvering, failed. But it didn't just stop working. It seized, locking the control surface in a partially deflected position. The F-22, a marvel of aerodynamic stability, was suddenly a bucking, uncontrollable beast. Alarms screamed in the cockpit. The HUD lit up with a cascade of red warnings. Flight control failure. Hydraulic pressure loss. The jet snapped into a vicious, rolling yaw, threatening to tear itself apart. Rook's training took over instantly. His movements were calm and precise, a stark contrast to the chaos erupting around him. He fought the roll with rudder and differential thrust, his mind working faster than the flashing warnings. He managed to wrestle the aircraft back to a semblance of level flight, but it was a tenuous, exhausting battle. The Raptor was crippled, flying bent, and every correction he made bled precious energy and altitude. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," he transmitted, his voice astonishingly level. "Ghost-1 is declaring an emergency. Flight control system failure. Uncommanded roll. I am fighting for control." He reached to cycle the hydraulic systems, a standard procedure. As his hand moved across the panel, a bright spark erupted from behind the main avionics display, followed by a wisp of acrid smoke. And then, silence. His primary communications array went dead. The comforting voice of the AWACS controller was replaced by a deafening hiss of static. "Redstone Control, this is Ghost-1. Do you read?" "I've lost primary comms," he said, switching to the backup frequency. The backup channel crackled to life, but it was weak, saturated with interference. "Ghost-1 read, garbled, say again," came the fractured reply from the tower. The situation had gone from critical to catastrophic. He was alone at 30,000 feet in a broken machine with a failing radio deep in the heart of the training range. Back on the ground, the atmosphere in the control tower had turned icy. They had heard the Mayday call. They had seen Ghost-1's radar track become erratic. And then they had lost reliable contact. In Hangar 14, Aris felt the change before she heard it. It was a subtle shift in the base's rhythm. The casual chatter over the maintenance channel ceased. A crash truck rolled past the hangar doors, its lights flashing silently, moving with a purpose that was urgent but not panicked. The unspoken admission hung in the air. Something was wrong. Seriously wrong. She stepped out into the blinding sun, her heart pounding a heavy, prophetic rhythm against her ribs. Her eyes scanned the sky, searching, and then she heard the fragmented transmission over the base-wide PA system, a desperate attempt by the tower to re-establish contact. Ghost-3 advised status. Ghost-1, the former Ghost-7. The blood drained from her face. It was happening. The seed she had seen planted was now bearing its bitter fruit. The clock she had been watching had just struck midnight. She didn't hesitate. There was no thought of protocol, of reprimands, of the consequences. There was only the image of a pilot in a failing machine, a problem she understood better than anyone else on this base. She dropped the rag she was holding, slung her personal toolkit, the one with her own specialized diagnostic gear, over her shoulder, and broke into a dead run. The control tower, a concrete monolith on the far side of the airfield, was her only destination. The sky was falling, and she was the only one who knew how to hold it up. The distance between Hangar 14 and the control tower had never seemed so vast. The air was a physical weight, thick with heat and the suffocating knowledge of what was unfolding miles above the earth. Every stride Aris took on the hot tarmac was a beat in a frantic countdown. Her toolkit, filled with custom-made electronics and precision instruments, slammed against her back, a heavy but necessary burden. She couldn't take the main access road. It would be too slow, and her presence, a lone figure running full tilt across the active part of the base, would be questioned and stopped within minutes. She needed the back ways, the maintenance corridors, the shortcuts known only to the ground crews and specialists who live in the base's hidden arteries. Her mind, a map of the base's infrastructure, plotted the course as she ran. She cut behind a row of fuel depots, her boots crunching on the gravel service path. The roar of a C-5 taking off from a parallel runway washed over her, a deafening wave of sound that she barely registered. Her focus was singular. She reached the perimeter of the main command and control sector, a high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. The main gate was manned by Air Force security forces. No chance, but she knew of a service gate further down, one used by the electrical maintenance teams. It was secured by a standard-issue padlock. As she ran, her fingers dug into a small pouch on her tool belt, retrieving a set of tension wrenches and a slim lockpick. It was a skill she'd picked up out of necessity, a way to access locked-down diagnostic panels when the authorized key holder was on another continent. It was against regulations, but regulations were about to get a pilot killed. She reached the gate, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She glanced around. No one in sight. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as she inserted the pick and wrench into the lock. She worked by feel, her mind translating the faint clicks of the tumblers into a mental image of the lock's interior. 30 seconds that felt like an eternity passed. Then a solid thunk. The lock sprang open. She slipped through the gate, not bothering to close it behind her, and sprinted across a manicured lawn toward the rear of the control tower complex. The tower itself was a fortress of concrete and glass, but like any fortress, it had a weakness. The rear service entrance. It led to the maintenance levels, the building's unglamorous but vital core. The door was heavy, steel, and secure by keypad lock. She didn't have the code, but she knew the model. She dropped to her knees, pulling the access panel off the wall beneath the keypad. Inside was a tangle of wires. Her eyes scanned the schematic she had memorized years ago. She pulled a small alligator clip from her kit and, with surgical precision, jumped 2 of the terminals. The lock's magnetic seal disengaged with a loud click. She was in. The corridor inside was cool and quiet, lit by the eerie, intermittent glow of emergency lights. The air smelled of dust and ozone. This was the tower's underbelly, a world away from the pristine, high-tech command center on the top floor. She didn't take the elevator or the main stairwell. They were too exposed. Instead, she headed for a narrow, unmarked door at the end of the hall. It opened onto a vertical maintenance shaft, a tight space filled with bundled cables and conduit, with a simple steel ladder bolted to the wall. It was a straight shot up to the comms and avionics relay floor, one level below the main control room. She began to climb, her toolkit slung across her chest to keep it from snagging. The metal rungs were cold under her hands. Halfway up, the sound began to filter down, voices sharp and strained, echoing in the shaft. It was the sound of controlled panic, of professionals facing a problem they couldn't solve. She recognized Colonel Valerius's voice first, a sharp, authoritative bark that couldn't quite conceal the strain beneath it. "Give me a clean signal. Reroute through the backup array. Now!" Then another voice, younger, frantic. "Sir, the backup is unstable. We're getting massive interference. It's a hardware issue. We can't fix it from the console." Aris climbed faster. The hardware issue. She knew what it was. The same kind of subharmonic vibration that could crack an actuator mount could, over time, degrade a sensitive crystal oscillator in a communications relay, especially if it wasn't properly shielded. It was a flaw in the design, a detail too small for anyone but a specialist obsessed with resonance dynamics to notice. She reached the top of the ladder, pushing open the heavy hatch that led into the communications relay room. The sight that greeted her confirmed her theory. The room was a maze of server racks, their fans humming a constant, low-frequency drone. In the far corner, a junior comms tech was staring helplessly at the backup communications array, its status lights flickering erratically, a chaotic, arrhythmic pulse. It was a dying heartbeat. The tech looked up, his eyes wide with shock as she strode past him. "Ma'am, you can't be in here. This is a restricted area." She ignored him, dropping her toolkit to the floor with a heavy thud. "Which module feeds the primary backup antenna?" she demanded, her voice cutting through his panic. "The upper right, but it's not responding to..." She was already pulling the main access panel off the array, revealing a dense, beautiful jungle of circuitry and wiring. Her eyes, trained to see order in chaos, found the problem in seconds. A single black LED, connected to the primary signal amplifier, had its shielding scorched. It had been arcing against the frame, a tiny, intermittent short circuit throwing the entire channel into chaos. "Kill power to this module," she ordered the tech. "But that's our last link to Ghost-1, he protested. "It's already useless," she snapped, not looking up. "It's just noise. Give me 30 seconds before you bring it back online." He hesitated, then complied. The module's died. In the sudden silence, Aris's hands became a blur of motion. She snipped the damaged lead, stripped a new length of shielded cable from her kit, and rerouted it, her fingers working with the innate, practiced confidence of a master craftsman. Each connection was seated with a firm, decisive click. "Now," she said. The tech restored power. The module spun up with a clean, steady whine. The chaotic, flickering lights on the front panel turned from amber to a solid, unwavering green. And through the overhead speakers, a voice, faint and ragged but miraculously clear, cut through the static. "Ow, this is Ghost-1. Fuel critical, approach unstable." It was Rook. He was still there. Aris scooped up her toolkit. She had given him a voice. Now, she had to give him a way home. She headed for the spiral staircase at the far end of the room, the one that led directly up into the heart of the storm. The spiral staircase was a cage of gray, perforated metal, and with every step Aris took, the sound from the control room above grew louder, clearer, and more desperate. The clipped, technical jargon of the controllers was now laced with an unmistakable edge of dread. She was climbing into the nerve center of a waking nightmare. She emerged through the floor, hatch, into the glass-walled tower cabin, a space that felt like the bridge of a starship. The room was a 360-degree panorama of the base, the sky, and the distant mountains. Every wall was lined with screens displaying radar sweeps, weather data, and aircraft statuses. And every person in that room, a dozen controllers and senior officers, froze and turned to stare at her as she rose into their midst like an apparition. They saw a woman in grease-stained coveralls, her red hair escaping its braid, her face smudged with dirt and determination. She held a heavy toolkit in one hand, and her eyes, burning with an intensity that eclipsed her disheveled appearance, were locked on one man. Colonel Valerius stood at the central command console, his back rigid. He was staring at the main radar display, where a single blip labeled Ghost-1 was tracing a dangerously erratic path back toward the base. He whipped around at the sound of her footsteps on the metal decking, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Thorne," he barked, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What in God's name do you think you're doing? I'll have you in a federal prison for this." Security. Two armed security forces airmen started to move toward her, but Aris didn't even flinch. She didn't break stride, walking directly toward Valerius, her gaze never leaving his. "I reconnected your backup channel, Colonel," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that stopped the airmen in their tracks. "The primary amplifier on your backup array had a resonance-induced short. It's fixed. You have partial but stable comms with Ghost-1." The entire room went silent. The controllers stared, first at her, then at their consoles, then at Valerius. The junior tech from the relay room below must have already called up, confirming her story. Valerius was momentarily stunned into silence. His mind, trapped in the rigid hierarchy of command, couldn't process what was happening. A civilian mechanic had just bypassed his authority, his security, and solved a problem his own expert team could not. "You are not authorized," he began, his voice sputtering with rage. "Do you want to get your pilot down alive, or do you want to debate my authorization while he augers into the desert?" She shot back, her voice cold and clear. The raw, brutal truth of her question hung in the air. It stripped away his rank, his authority, his ego, and left only the stark reality of the situation. A man was about to die, and this woman was the only one in the room who seemed to know what to do. He stared at her, his jaw working silently. For the first time since she had met him, Colonel Valerius looked utterly lost. Aris didn't wait for his permission. She brushed past him, reaching the primary flight control console. She grabbed a spare headset, the one used by supervising officers, and slipped it on, adjusting the boom mic to her lips. Her fingers flew across the console, keying into the newly stabilized backup channel. The faint, steady hiss of an open line filled her ears. "Ghost-1, this is Redstone Tower. My name is Dr. Aris Thorne. I have you on a partial but clear channel. How do you copy?" A pause. The entire room held its breath. Then, Rook's voice, ragged with exhaustion and strain, but blessedly there. "Tower, read you. Barely. Controls are a mess. I'm fighting a hard right roll. Hydraulic pressure is failing." "I know, Major," Aris said, her voice a sudden oasis of calm in the storm of panic. "I've worked on your bird. You have a seized flapper and actuator. It's causing a feedback loop in your primary hydraulic system. We're going to fix that." From the corner of her eye, she saw Valerius stiffen, his authority reasserting itself. "You are not authorized to instruct a pilot in an emergency situation, Doctor. That is the job of the flight controller." Aris turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting his. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Your flight controller knows how to read a checklist, Colonel. I know how this machine bleeds. There's a difference." She turned back to the console. "Now, I suggest you let me work, or you can explain to the investigation board why you prioritize protocol over the life of your best pilot." Valerius opened his mouth, then closed it. He was beaten. In his own command center, surrounded by his own people, he had been rendered irrelevant. He took a half step back, effectively ceding the stage. The controllers, taking their cue from this silent surrender, turned their full attention to Aris. They began feeding her data, airspeed, altitude, fuel state, wind shear reports, their voices now working in concert with hers. They were a team, and she was improbably their leader. Aris looked at the data streams, her mind processing the complex variables with terrifying speed. She wasn't just a mechanic anymore. She wasn't a pariah. In that moment, she was the only thing that mattered. She had raced against silence and won. She had rewired the tower's broken nervous system. Now, she had to rewire fate itself. "All right, Rook." Aris's voice was steady in his ear, a lifeline of calm in the screaming chaos of his cockpit. "Forget the primary hydraulics. They're gone. We're going to bypass them. I need you to look at the panel just aft of your throttle quadrant. You're looking for a red, guarded lever. It's marked auxiliary flap release. Do you see it?" Rook's breathing was audible over the channel, the harsh, ragged sound of a man exerting immense physical and mental effort. The F-22 was fighting him with every ounce of its damaged power. "Got it," he grunted. "This is a two-stage release," Aris instructed, her eyes flicking between the radar scope and the fuel state display. He was losing altitude faster than she liked. "First, lift the guard. Second, push the lever forward and hold it for a full 3 seconds. You're going to feel a significant pressure dump from the emergency accumulator. It will feel violent. Don't fight it. That will engage the manual cable controls for the flaps. They will be sluggish and unresponsive, but they will be yours. Are you ready?" "Ready." Rook's voice was tight. "Engaging on my mark. 3, 2, 1. Mark." Aris watched the radar blip. It wavered, dipped sharply, then began to stabilize. "Override engaged," Rook reported, his voice strained. "It feels heavy, like I'm flying a truck." "That's what we want," Aris affirmed. "You are now flying the plane, Major. Is no longer flying you. Now, let's manage your speed. You're coming in too hot. I need you to reduce throttle in small increments. If you dump it all at once, the pitch will fight you, and you don't have the hydraulic authority to win. Small changes. Be ready to compensate with rudder. As if summoned by her words, a new alert flashed on the main weather display. A sudden, severe wind shear warning had just been posted along the primary runway's approach path. A collective gasp went through the control room. For a crippled aircraft, a strong wind shear was a death sentence. Aris didn't hesitate. Ghost-1, abort approach to primary runway. I repeat, abort. We have severe wind shear. We're diverting you to the secondary runway. 2-1. It's shorter, but we're going to catch the wire. The arrestor cable. It was a system used for emergencies. A thick steel cable stretched across the runway, designed to snag a jet's tailhook and bring it to a violent, abrupt stop. It was a brutal but effective way to land a plane that couldn't stop itself. Copy, Rook said, his trust in her voice absolute. Turning for secondary, Aris became a conductor, orchestrating a symphony of survival. Her voice was the baton, guiding Rook through the long, difficult banking turn. Every instruction was grounded in her profound, intuitive understanding of the machine's broken physics. Easy on the turn, Rook. Don't ask for more than she can give you. Use your rudder to lead the bank. That's it. Hold that attitude. Watch your airspeed. It's dropping too fast. Give a nudge of throttle. Good. Below, the base was a blur of motion. The crash trucks and fire suppression rigs, which had been positioned for the main runway, were now racing across the airfield to the secondary. The ground crew scrambled to ensure the arrestor cable was properly tensioned. The F-22 appeared on final approach, a wounded bird coming home. It was fast, its nose pitched higher than normal, its wings rocking slightly as Rook fought the unstable air. It was a terrifying, beautiful sight. You're looking good, Rook. Just a little longer, Aris murmured, her voice a hypnotic, calming presence. Tailhook is down and locked. Keep your wings level. Fly the plane all the way to the ground. Don't flare too early. In the control room, no one breathed. Valerius stood frozen, his face pale, watching the drama unfold on the massive glass windows. He was a spectator at his own disaster. The Raptor screamed over the runway threshold. It was a controlled crash, a masterpiece of piloting skill guided by a genius on the ground. At the last possible second, Rook let it drop. The landing gear slammed onto the tarmac with a brutal, shuddering impact. The tailhook snagged the arrestor cable with a sound like a rifle shot, a loud, violent whip crack that echoed across the airfield. The jet was thrown forward, its nose dipping violently as the cable stretched taut, absorbing the massive kinetic energy of the 20-ton fighter. It decelerated with impossible speed, shuddering to a halt in a cloud of tire smoke and raw, unadulterated victory, less than halfway down the runway. For a long, silent moment, the only sound in the control tower was the faint electronic hum of the consoles. Then, Rook's voice, shaky but triumphant, filled the speakers. Tower! Ghost-1 is on the deck. Safe. A tidal wave of cheers and applause erupted in the room. Controllers were on their feet, clapping, shouting, some hugging each other in relief. It was a spontaneous, cathartic explosion of emotion. Aris slowly lowered the headset from her ears, placing it gently on the console. Her hands were trembling now, the adrenaline finally beginning to recede. She didn't join the celebration. Her eyes remained fixed on the small, gray, motionless shape out on the tarmac. Intact. Alive. She turned, her gaze sweeping past the celebrating controllers, past the stunned junior officers, and landing, finally, on Colonel Valerius. He said nothing. He couldn't. His face was a complex mask of shock, humiliation, and a dawning, grudging respect. Without a word, Aris picked up her toolkit. Her work here was done. She turned and walked toward the stairwell hatch, the sounds of celebration fading behind her as she descended back into the quiet, mechanical heart of the tower. The air in the official debriefing room was thick with the scent of stale coffee and palpable tension. It was a windowless, sterile space designed for unvarnished truth and the assignment of blame. Senior officers, flight controllers, and the wing's safety investigation team filed in, their faces grim, their conversations muted. The near loss of an F-22 Raptor was a monumental event, and everyone in this room knew their actions, or inactions, were under a microscope. Colonel Valerius sat at the head of the long conference table, his posture as rigid as ever, but the usual air of supreme confidence had been replaced by a brittle, defensive stillness. He was a king presiding over a court that was about to pass judgment on his reign. The door opened, and Major Kalen Rook Vance walked in. He had changed out his flight suit, but he still carried the aura of the cockpit with him. A faint weariness around the eyes, but an undeniable intensity in his gaze. The low murmur of conversation in the room ceased. Every eye followed him as he crossed the front. He didn't take the seat reserved for him. Instead, he remained standing, his hands resting on the back of a chair, and faced the assembled personnel. "Yesterday," he began, his voice calm and clear, carrying to every corner of the room, "I took Ghost-1 up for a training sortie. Approximately 20 minutes into the flight, I experienced a catastrophic failure of the starboard flapper and actuator, which led to a cascading failure in the primary hydraulic and communication systems." He paused, letting the clinical description of his near-death experience settle in the quiet room. No one shuffled papers. No one coughed. "I followed emergency protocol. Nothing worked." Rook continued, his eyes sweeping the room before landing directly on Colonel Valerius. "I was out of fuel, out of altitude, and out of options. I was preparing for ejection over the range when a new voice came on the channel. It wasn't a controller. It wasn't another pilot. It was a civilian mechanic. Dr. Aris Thorne. A subtle but perceptible ripple went through the room. Names were being named. This was no longer a technical debriefing. It was becoming a reckoning. "Dr. Thorne," Rook said, his voice resonating with conviction, "diagnosed the specific mechanical failure from the ground with nothing more than my description of the aircraft's behavior. She guided me through a manual override procedure that is not in any standard emergency checklist because it requires a level of mechanical understanding no pilot possesses. When an unexpected wind shear threatened the primary runway, she, not the tower controllers, made the command decision to divert me to the secondary runway for a cable arrestment. I followed her instructions to the letter, and I'm standing here today alive because of it." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the weight of his words. "I have since been made aware," Rook went on, his voice hardening, "that Dr. Thorne identified a potential fault in this exact actuator weeks ago. She brought her concerns to the flight line, and she was publicly dismissed and silenced. She was then reassigned to menial duties in what I can only assume was a punitive action." He looked directly at Valerius again. Her expert warning was ignored. Valerius visibly flinched, a faint flush rising on his neck. "Therefore," Rook concluded, his voice ringing with command authority, "I am making two official recommendations. First, that Dr. Aris Thorne be awarded the Air Force Civilian Award for Valor, the highest honor we can bestow. Second, that she be granted an immediate waiver and commission for officer training school. This Air Force needs people with her knowledge, her courage, and her integrity in the cockpit and in command, not just on the hangar floor." He finished speaking and stood there, an immovable object of principle. The spell was broken. The truth was out. Heads slowly began to turn, one by one, toward Colonel Valerius, whose carefully constructed world had just been dismantled in front of his peers. That evening, there was a knock on the door of Aris's small, Spartan quarters. She opened it to find Colonel Valerius standing there. He was not in his dress uniform, but in a simple flight suit, stripped of the trappings of command. In his hands, he held a familiar, custom-bound leather book. "Her journal." "Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice low, devoid of its usual arrogance. It was the voice of a man who had been profoundly humbled. "I was wrong. My judgment was not just flawed. It was a dereliction of my duty to the safety of my pilots and a disservice to your expertise. There is no excuse." He extended the journal. She took it, the familiar weight a comforting anchor in her hands. "This," he continued, producing a sealed envelope from a pocket, "is a formal, written letter of apology, signed by me. A copy will be placed in your permanent service record, alongside my full and unreserved endorsement of Major Vance's recommendations. He met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw not a tyrant, but just a man, flawed and defeated. The Air Force needs you, Doctor, more than it needs men like me. He gave a single, short nod, a gesture that was almost a bow, and stepped back. You'll report to the OTS liaison office at 0800 tomorrow. Congratulations, Lieutenant. She closed the door slowly, her back resting against it. She set the envelope on her small desk and opened her journal. The pages were exactly as she had left them, filled with her wild, brilliant, and now vindicated ideas. She sat on the edge of her bed, the distant sound of a night sortie drifting through the window. For the first time in months, the silence in her room didn't feel like exile. It felt like peace. The reckoning was over. Tomorrow, her real journey would begin. The entrance to officer training school at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama was a world away from the sun-blasted plains of Nellis. Here, the air was thick with humidity and the scent of pine and old tradition. The buildings were brick and ivy, steeped in the history of command. But for Aris, now officer candidate Thorne, the change in scenery meant little. The challenges were simply different, the tests more subtle, but no less demanding. She was an anomaly from day one. Older than most of her classmates, a civilian by background, and a woman in a field still dominated by men who had dreamed of flying since childhood. Her direct commission was a source of whispers and suspicion. They knew the official story, a heroic act, a recommendation from a top pilot, but the rumors from Nellis had followed her. She was the colonel's pet project, the beneficiary of a political fix. The first few weeks were a crucible of physical and academic rigor. Long runs in the humid Alabama morning, obstacle courses designed to break you, and classroom sessions that drilled down on leadership theory, military law, and the ethics of command. Aris, whose life had been a study of physical systems, now had to master the infinitely more complex systems of human leadership. She didn't try to win them over with words. She knew that respect in this world wasn't requested. It was forged. In the classroom, while others struggled with the complex physics of advanced weapon systems, she would quietly and clearly explain the principles, drawing diagrams on the whiteboard that were models of elegant clarity. In leadership exercises, when her squad was given a seemingly impossible problem-solving task, she wouldn't bark orders. She would listen, analyze the strengths of each team member, and devise a logical, efficient plan that utilized everyone. The turning point came during the advanced flight simulation phase. The candidates were put into high-fidelity F-22 simulators and thrown into nightmare scenarios. One such scenario involved a two-ship formation on a reconnaissance mission when a solar flare knocked out their primary navigation and communication systems, leaving them blind and deaf over hostile territory. Her wingman, a cocky young candidate who had been one of the most vocal skeptics, began to panic, his simulated aircraft deviating from formation. Standard procedure was to ascend to a higher altitude and attempt to re-establish contact. Aris did the opposite. Negative, she said over the internal comms, her voice a spike of pure calm. Ascending makes us a bigger target. We're going low. We're going to use the terrain to mask our approach. She cut her speed, stabilized her aircraft, and began using the one system the solar flare couldn't touch, her own mind. She used her last known position, calculated their drift based on wind speed and fuel consumption, and began plotting a new course on the simulator's backup map display, a course that would take them through a narrow, winding canyon system. It was incredibly dangerous, requiring a level of pure stick and rudder skill most modern pilots had lost. Follow my lead, she ordered. Maintain 500 feet separation. Keep your eyes outside the cockpit. Fly the plane, not the instruments. For 20 minutes, she led him on a breathtaking, high-speed run through the simulated canyons, her inputs on the controls smooth and precise. She was not just flying, she was dancing with the machine. When they finally emerged into friendly airspace, exactly on her predicted course, the simulation ended. The instructor's voice came over the speakers, quiet and awestruck. Candidate Thorne, where did you learn to do that? Aris took a slow breath. The simulation's tension finally leaving her. When you take everything else away, she said simply, all that's left is the math and the sky. In the debriefing room, there were no more whispers. Her wingman walked up to her, his earlier arrogance gone, replaced by a look of profound respect. I would have flown us into a mountain, he said quietly. You saved my life, even if it was just a sim. I'd fly with you anywhere, ma'am. From that day on, she wasn't the outsider anymore. She was the standard, the one they came to for help with flight dynamics, the one whose opinion they sought in tactical planning. She had proven that leadership wasn't about the volume of your voice, but the depth of your knowledge and the steadiness of your nerve. On graduation day, she stood on the parade ground, the Alabama sun warm on her face. As they pinned the gold bars of second lieutenant onto her collar, she saw Major Rook Vance in the crowd, giving her a slow, proud nod. Her first assignment was back at Nellis. Not in Hangar 14, not even in Hangar 7. She was assigned as a flight lead in the 422nd Test and Evaluation Squadron, the elite unit known as the Greenbats, responsible for developing the tactics of the future. As she walked across the tarmac for her first flight as a commissioned officer, she passed a group of new mechanics working on an F-22. One of them, a young woman with bright, intelligent eyes, looked up at her with a mixture of awe and recognition. Aris paused, giving the young mechanic a small, knowing smile. Keep listening to the machine, she said quietly. It'll tell you everything you need to know. She climbed into the cockpit of her Raptor, the canopy sealing her into the familiar, silent world. She looked out at the runway stretching before her, a path into the endless blue. The journey had been through fire, through exile, through doubt, but had forged her. Every dismissal, every challenge had been a hammer blow shaping her into what she was now. The tower's voice crackled in her headset, clear and strong. Ghost-1, you are cleared for takeoff. She pushed the throttle forward, and with a roar that was no longer a sound of exile, but a cry of triumph, she left the earth behind and climbed into the sky that was, and always had been, rightfully hers. This is Veteran Biker, and if that story doesn't make you want to stand up and cheer, you might want to check your pulse. We just witnessed the journey of Dr. Aris Thorne, a woman who was silenced, dismissed, and cast out. They tried to ground her, to lock away her knowledge, to make her small. But they made a critical mistake. They forgot that you can't cage a mind that was born to soar. They forgot that true authority isn't pinned to a collar. It's earned in the crucible of crisis. This story isn't just about a pilot or a mechanic. It's for anyone who has ever had their expertise questioned, their passion dismissed, or their voice silenced by someone who values rank over reason. It's for the quiet ones in the back of the room who see the flaw in the plan that no one else does. It's for the people who do the work, not for the applause, but because the work must be done. Aris's journey reminds us that the most powerful response to disrespect isn't a loud argument. It's quiet, undeniable competence. It's the relentless pursuit of excellence, even when no one is watching. Because when the moment of crisis comes, and it always comes, the titles, the ranks, and the egos fall away. All that's left is the truth. And on that day, the voice that was once dismissed becomes the only one that matters. So, here's what I'll ask you to do. Take a moment and drop a comment below. We want to build a community here, a place where these stories live on. Tell us where you're watching from. More importantly, tell us about a time you had to prove yourself against the odds, or about a mentor who saw your potential when no one else would. Let's honor those moments. Comment with respect, and let's lift each other up. And if this story resonated with you, if you felt the heat of that tarmac and the cold fury of being underestimated, then hit that like button. Subscribe to Veteran Biker and join our squadron, because we've got a lot more missions to fly and a lot more stories of quiet heroes to tell. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and never let anyone tell you how high you can fly. This is Veteran Biker, signing off.